Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rituals of Strength, your fortress of solitude, of resilience and resolve. I'm your host, Kevin Secor, and this week we are going to be delving into the role of fear, aggression, and its effect on your performance. Now, this week's episode is actually a reply going back to episode 5 that aired on March 16th, which was entitled, How Ferocious Should You Train to Become? In that particular week, I looked at some of the dominant mindsets and ideas in the self-defense world in particular. But I was looking at training in general. And I got a huge response from this. A lot of people were incensed and downright angry. I think the most triggering of the topics was this old self-defense notion that it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Although as I was very clear, I understand the emotion of this sentiment, this idea that, hey man, I can't be all preoccupied with worrying about what's right and what's not, and ultimately efficiency and survival is my number one goal. I argued that it is rarely so dualistic. It's rarely as black and white. It's rarely a matter of deciding between whether or not I have to completely kill you with absolute abandon and, resolute aggression, or be completely inept and ineffective. And this is often this dualistic switch that people govern themselves by. I argued simply that in a real self-defense dynamic, there are countless amounts of variables and that it exists on a huge spectrum. So some of the complaints were polite, people saying things like, I don't think you realize, I don't think you meant to say that aggression was bad. They couldn't believe it. Some were diplomatic but argumentative, and most were angry. They were angry people in angry support of being angry, saying things like, you can't tell me not to be angry and I'm going to kill them all and let God sort them out. I actually mocked that as an example of how low the thinking gets, and then I had 4 people critique me by using that as their defense. So, first of all, in response, I want to say, guys, at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. Now, have I trained for over 4 decades in countless martial arts? Do I have numerous advanced ranks? Do I have a lot of experience with real-world violence? Yes, I do. And in my opinion, that does make my view maybe a bit more qualified than the casual armchair warrior. But that being said, there are people that have been to war, been in combat. There are law enforcement officers and security professionals, and there are veterans in the martial arts who patently disagree with what I say. And that's fine. I often tell my students that if nothing else, you're going to disagree with everything I'm about to say, and in disagreeing, you're going to make your own opinions more resolute and more certain. And that's good. That's what we're here to do, guys. This is nothing but an exchange of ideas, and that's one of the reasons I try to give you as many thought exercises as I do. What I'd like to do in this episode is I would like to look at some science. I would like to look at some research that's been done from various domains. There is not much in the domain of actual self-defense training where it specifically looks at a comparative analysis between training with varying degrees of aggression. Sadly, that does not yet exist. But there's a lot of research from military and other top performance fields that does specifically look at anxiety, aggression, and rage. And we're going to look at that from a few different perspectives. I'm going to argue that even if you're still a proponent of the rather be judged by 12 than, carried by 6 mindset, that you can achieve those goals more effectively without investing fully in rage. I go back to the famous boxing trainer Cus D'Amato, who said that famously, anger is like a fire. It can cook your dinner or it can burn your house down. He said the same thing of fear. We need to know how to control these emotions. If you go back to my very first book, The Dragon Mind Method, I outline various schools of thought on how humans basically evolved as a society. And although there were early killer ape theories that posited that we were somehow super alpha predators, in actual fact, as naked animals, we lack the fangs and the claws of most of the other alpha predators, and it seems that we achieved any sort of survival and ultimately dominance by our intellect, by the ability to communicate, by the ability to make tools, and by the ability to operate in teams. These are huge factors in how we function. It is precisely our cognitive minds that gave us an advantage, and I would argue that it does not suddenly make sense to sacrifice that cognition, to sacrifice that superpower, if you will, in search of combative excellence. Think for a moment if you were stranded in a war zone and then you got rescued by a team of the most elite special forces operatives in the world. Would you rather have soldiers around you that had never had combat experience, who seemed particularly trigger happy, maybe very emotional, very screaming and yelling and in rage? Would you like to have them twitchy and hypervigilant? Or would you rather have a calm, even tempered professional who was humming along in their zone of optimal performance? What about if you or a loved one was going into surgery tomorrow? Would you like your surgeon to come into the operating theater in a state of reckless, heightened emotional excitement? Would you like them to be angry about the surgery and to attack your cancerous brain growth with rage? Now, you could argue, well, brain surgery is a precision skill, even though they're dealing with extreme stress and high levels of pressure. It's a precision skill, and it's quite different from combat, right? Certainly, for the great majority of our time here on Earth, humans have survived by muscularly hacking through one another on the battlefield. The argument could be made that with modern weapons like guns, explosives, that we need more fine motor skill in order to operate them, but that with self-defense, with civilian or hand-to-hand combative self-defense, that muscular hacking still works. Fine, I could accept that. But let me ask you this. The next time you're on a plane and you're going through some stormy weather, although this is not a combative activity that benefits from muscular gross motor engagement, it's still a very high pressured scenario. Those pilots are responsible possibly for hundreds of lives. I think all of us would agree we would rather have a calm pilot at the helm, just like we would rather have calm special forces operators to protect us or calm surgeons to operate. Hell, I'd rather have a calm tax accountant. I'd rather have anyone around me operating with optimal efficiency, void of any aggression. Even if we're going to use this argument that hand-to-hand combat is somehow different, if we look through the history of combat, we see there are various ways to approach it. And certainly some of the greatest warriors of all time favored calmness. Miyamoto Musashi, who is arguably the most famous swordsman in the history of Japan, who survived dozens of lethal duels in his life, famously wrote, "Both in fighting and in everyday life, you should be determined, though calm. Meet the situation without tenseness, yet not recklessly. Your spirit unsettled, yet unbiased. Even when your spirit is calm, do not let your body relax. And when your body is relaxed, do not let your spirit slacken. Do not let your spirit be influenced by your body, or your body be influenced by your spirit." This perfectly encapsulates this idea of a zone of optimal performance, of a calm elite operative. We're not saying to be loosey-goosey, relaxed and aloof. He's saying do not slacken. But there's a difference between that and engaging with full rage. Usually anger is coming from a place of fear. You guys know I'm a big fan of Stoics. I'm going to quote another great one from Seneca. And he said, "How much better to heal than it is to seek revenge from an injury. Vengeance wastes a lot of time and it exposes you to many more injuries than the first one that sparked it. Anger always outlasts hurt." It's a great line. Anger always outlasts hurt. It is best to take the opposite course. Would anyone think it normal to return a kick to a mule or a bite to a dog? Great, great, great quote. Now, sounds poetic, and sometimes when we get down into the weeds, it's not quite so simple to respect that poetry. When we start talking about things like self-defense, it is quite normal to get emotional. Look, if I look at typical marketing, You will invariably have exaggerations of dark alleys and scary streets, weapons being drawn. Some of the most famous and influential reality based self defense instructors in the world routinely post evidence, video and research evidence, statistical evidence of the violence in the world. And it can be argued that this is great for building awareness, but it could also be argued that to some level it is sensationalistic. A recent one that was going around was this AI rendering of a father, a husband holding a large butcher knife with his wife and kids behind him. And it was to the effect of, are you man enough and are you ready to take responsibility? And what would you do in this kind of a case of a home invasion? Even though statistically, the likelihood of an armed home invasion is extremely low in most parts of the world, this sparks a lot of emotion. It gets clicks, it gets viewers, it even motivates people to train. Now, I'm not saying that I've never used this kind of advertisement. I'm not saying that I've never operated according to this kind of thinking. I'm simply saying that through my life, I've invested in rage and anger, and I've invested in trying to be a higher level operative. And I would argue that it is superior to invest in a calm control rather than just brute rage. So let's look at study number 1. First study I'm going to be quoting is Anxiety Effects on Disaster Precautionary Behaviors, a Multi-Path Cognitive Model. And this is by Philip W. Wirtz, Cynthia A. Rohrbach, and Catherine McBurns. Now, this study looked specifically at people taking precautions for disasters, which is not directly self-defense, but we can certainly see the relationship. What it found was that anxiety motivated greater precautionary behavior. And if you were hypervigilant and extremely anxious, you were super prepared, maybe even exaggerating the risks that you were exposed to. It showed that anxiety increased the perceived likelihood and the severity of the disaster. So if we equate that to self-defense, if we overinflate the motivation, if we overinflate the risk of danger, for example, getting attacked by a knife on the street, it is possible that we're going to start to see risks and opportunities that aren't there, and it is possible that we might respond more severely than we intended to. I can tell you, as a bouncer, I worked with guys that were calm, I worked with guys that were aloof, and I worked with guys that were alpha, aggro, super aggressive. Those aggressive guys, hands down, got us into more scenarios needlessly, never avoided, never de-escalated, and had more excessive force complaint issues, whether they be legal or whether they be social consequence, where people come back to curb stomp them. All of those bad situations occurred from people who were extremely aggressive. So experientially, in my experience, absolutely hands down true. This study also showed that higher anxiety levels might diminish an individual's confidence and their ability to effectively prepare for disaster, what they termed self-efficacy. So there is a level in our hypervigilance where it starts to pay diminishing returns, and we become so inept with that fear that we just become angry all the time. I have known self-defense practitioners who have socially conducted themselves in ways that is very resentful against society, that is extremely angry. They're always getting into flame wars. They're always getting into, coffee shop arguments with people. I've had people argue on forums about the effectiveness of verbal de-escalation, and they're getting angry while arguing about the merits of verbal de-escalation. They don't even realize how ironic and funny that is. So thought exercise number 1. Can you think of any instance in your own personal life where anxiety specifically, and you pre-thinking about a particular problem, reduced your confidence and ultimately maybe gave you the yips, made you choke, made you perform less well than you would have because you over worried? So, guys, I just want to be really clear here. I'm in no way against planning and preparation. My whole life is planning and preparation. I'm a teacher in self defense. Of course, I believe in planning and preparation. Anyone who knows me knows that I get everywhere early, I overplan. It's my nature. But sometimes we can get overly emotional in that preparation, and we can, in effect, rehearse our failure rather than paving our way to our success. So I think it's important to take stock of any circumstances we might think of where we kind of, screwed the pooch because we got a little bit too nervous. Study number 2 we're going to look at is the use of fear and anger to alter crisis initiation. This one's by Lisa J. Carlson and Raymond Dacey, and that was published in 2014. So this specifically examines how the emotions of fear and anger influence the decision-making process at the initiation of a crisis. So just when something's about to begin, about to kick off. And I think this is something that I can tell you I see a lot in self-defense circles when people are arguing about preparation. So there are 4 key findings that come out of this. The first is about fear and risk aversion. Individuals that are experiencing fear tend to be averse to risk. They don't want to take chances. Fear makes us become very efficient in how we use our resources. It can make them pessimistic about risk assessment, and this emotional state can lead to decisions that avoid initiating a crisis. So sometimes fear has a bad rap, but fear as a natural evolutionary byproduct has been shown to increase our desire to avoid. Anger, by comparison, increases the likelihood of risk seeking. So, when anger is associated with risk seeking behavior, people become overly optimistic about risk assessments, and it potentially increases the likelihood of them volunteering for a crisis or initiating a crisis. And this is no surprise, guys. I have to give you the studies to prove it, but it's no surprise. People are more likely to sign up for the military if they're angry than if they're frightened. People are more likely to engage in a fight if they're angry, if they're insulted, than if they're frightened. We know anger is a powerful motivator. The study looked at the effectiveness of emotional appeals, and it identified conditions under which evoking fear or anger can effectively deter or provoke a crisis. Generally, this depended heavily on the context, and it did vary from individuals. But overall, it found consistent that anger was a motivator and fear was an avoider. Fear would help you to sort of avoid. Lastly, the study looked at counterproductive outcomes. In some scenarios, attempts to manipulate emotions, to cognitively manipulate them to create a behavior, can backfire. It led to unintended consequences such as escalation. So somebody trying to act brave got a little bit too angry to motivate it. They ultimately wanted to de-escalate, but because they invested in anger, it actually ended up escalating the encounter. So what's our responsibility? What is worth the risk? I would ask you, do you regard yourself as being more effective when angry? I do not. My life experience has shown me that I am not. You might identify with your angry self, and you might currently believe that's better for you. And I'm not arguing against that. Can you think of any situation where anger made you more willing to engage in a situation? And look at that situation. Do you think using anger to engage was the best solution? Do you think it was the only solution? Can you visualize any other way that might have been at least as effective wherein you could have avoided that circumstance? Study 3 I'm going to look at is the use of fear and threat-based messages to motivate preparedness. Costs, consequences, and other choices, and this is by Anna Marie Jones. This paper critically examined the very common use of fear as an appeal in disaster preparedness campaigns. And these are something that we're seeing more and more. I live in Montreal. We're not an earthquake or a tornado zone, but more and more Radio ads are telling us to have 72 hours of food and water in the house, and disaster preparedness is becoming something very common. Many of you live in areas where disaster preparedness has been there for decades and it's always been part of your life. Now, despite substantial investments in these types of campaigns, public preparedness statistically remains insufficient. Consumer apathy continues to persist, even though fear is being used. People surveyed still feel like they have a lack of time to prepare or a lack of financial constraints. So people are not only not getting prepared, they're still making excuses, despite fear being used as a dominant theme in the advertisement. So the end result is that most people are insufficiently prepared. If you would like to see proof of this in the self-defense martial arts world, you go back to 1993 with the advent of Ultimate Fighting. When the UFC came out, it was a global wake-up call that spawned the birth of mixed martial arts. People started to see that limitations in fighting range, like an inability to fight on the ground, was a huge detriment, and people needed to cross-train. Certain styles, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai, showed to be, or let's say wrestling and boxing for that matter, proved to be much more effective in the ring overall. Statistically, there are always exceptions. And this led to a massive awakening in what is considered real fighting. If you look at most internet complaints or criticisms, they will invariably boil down to, if this works, show me in the ring, right? As the ring has become the ultimate measuring litmus test. You have seen chi masters getting exposed and challenged by MMA fighters. You've seen masters being debunked. But despite all of this, and despite an overall trend towards so-called reality and training, those chi masters still exist. They still fill seminars. People routinely comment on these videos. I don't even understand how these people still get students. As I wrote about in Rituals of Strength, my book, if a doomsday cult tells you the world is going to end on a given day, and then that day passes and the world doesn't end, the cult does not cease to exist. People keep joining. People that are there often stay. Yeah, some may leave, but things just carry on. Lawsuits happen, cults carry on. So it is not enough to simply show effectiveness or ineffectiveness, and it is certainly not enough to motivate that awareness of the ineffectiveness by using fear. Now, this same paper, the use of fear and threat-based messages, they offer as a solution that if you are more of a, let's call it a prepper mindset, you're probably likely to feel, and you're probably going to argue that your enthusiasm is the actual antidote to that apathy and that lack of preparation. Everyone else is, not getting ready, but it's precisely because you're a prepper, and maybe, yes, you do over prepare, but you might counter argue that over preparation is better than no preparation, right? And I would agree with that. The author of the paper advocates reframing preparedness, and they say make it into an empowering and accessible endeavor. They submit that by focusing on more positive messaging, like community engagement and practical guidance, by showing the benefits of learning skills, the security that comes from that, that individuals are more likely to be inclined to take proactive steps in disaster readiness. Now, if you're working for an organization or a company, if you're in management, this is something really important to keep in mind. But if you are a self-defense instructor, I would say look at how you're advertising things. If it is mostly fear-based rather than mostly reward-based, it is likely to inevitably lead down this road, or else you're going to get a room around you filled with angry preppers, and maybe that's what you want. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying that sometimes that's a very narrow, focused lens. If I use myself as an example, I do things with which other martial artists might criticize. I study and I teach offensive weapon use, knife, gun, and I have no desire to ever have to use these skills. I've been in scenarios with weapons, they're terrible. I do it because I believe that by exposing myself to them, I make something that is formerly fearful more familiar. And I believe that by making it more familiar, I reduce my arousal to it. I increase the probability that I'll stay calm and optimally efficient. I also know that if I'm attacked by something, the more familiar I am with its use, the better my defense is going to be because I have a more realistic understanding of the potential of the weapon. And yes, lastly, if the weapon ever ends up in my hands and I'm required to use it, I certainly want to know how to use it. But that third factor is the least motivating of all the factors that's guiding me. All right, here's another study. This one's entitled The Scared, the Outraged, and the Anxious: How Crisis Emotions, Involvement, and Demographics Predict Public's Cognitive Coping. And this one was conducted by Yan Jin, Julia Daisy Faustino, and Brooke Fisher Lee. This is a study of 1,840 adults from the United States, and it looks at how emotions like fear, anger, and anxiety influence public responses during a hypothetical terrorist attack. Now, the emotional predictors. The study identified that emotions like fright, anger, and anxiety significantly predicted how an individual would respond to a crisis. These are generalizations, but this is what it found statistically. Individuals experiencing fear were more likely to engage in information-seeking behavior, and they were more likely to share crisis-related information. So, if we look at social media and we want shares, we know, and we've seen this firsthand, fear is more likely to encourage this. If we look at the previous study where we said fear was more likely to encourage and motivate avoidance, this directly falls into it. So in this case, it's avoidance and sharing, avoidance and gossiping. Anger was associated with higher likelihoods of individuals discussing the crisis and taking action to address the situation. And again, entirely consistent with what we saw before, initiating anger, having more severity in the response, more akin to anger. Anxiety was likely to increase vigilance and led to a preference for seeking information to better understand the crisis. Anxiety could lead to prudence, but it could also lead to complete inability. So, we could ask, do we think our current training is promoting and encouraging fear, anger, or anxiety? It may be promoting all three to an extent, but which of those three do you think is dominant? And to be really sure, we could reverse engineer it. Do you find yourself mostly seeking information and sharing information? Are you more of a researcher? In that case, likely fear is motivating you. Do you see yourself taking action, whether it's arguing online or getting involved in feuds with people? Do you feel a need to be like a self-defense missionary and to convert people? The desire to convert is very much a proactive emotion, and that's probably coming from a place of anger at some level. Or do you see yourself really being kind of neutral, very nervous, but seeking out lots of information, doing lots of research still, but not really sharing, really holding back your views? Then you probably are more motivated by anxiety. Again, none of these are judgments, guys, but we have to know where we're coming from in order to know where we're going. I'm very self-aware when I teach my own students, my friends, my loved ones. And I think it's important as practitioners that we get some level of actualization and self-realizations from our training. All right, the next study is Preparing for a Crisis, Examining the Influence of Fear and Anxiety on Consumption and Compliance. And this is from Elria Kemp, Mila Bree, and McDowell Porter. Now, this study found that what they termed ruminative or looping and spiral types of thinking were more often associated with feelings of fear and anxiety, while trust in leadership was negatively related to these emotions. So if somebody was had a lot of faith in their leaders and their management, they tended to be really calm and complacent. This is how somebody, for example, can keep voting for a political party even if they completely failed in their past term. It's because that's what they've always done and they just prefer to have faith. If you tend to be the type that ruminates and thinks and loops and spirals in their brain, then that's going to tend to lead more towards feelings of fear and anxiety. So it specifically looked at the COVID virus, and it showed that people that experienced more fear and anxiety tended to do things like bulk purchase and make a lot of impulse buys. And they tended to also be more adherent to guidelines. These are the people arguing that you have to wear masks and getting incensed if you didn't. And they were, obviously very eager to get vaccines and to police that activity. Now, extracting that from the COVID issue, which can be really political and sometimes emotional for no value, can you think of a situation where you might have binged or impulse purchased because of emotion? Certainly, I can tell you myself, during COVID, I didn't go out and buy 3,000 rolls of toilet paper, and I wasn't getting into fistfights for hand sanitizer. I stayed really calm. I had food in the house. I tried to avoid going out for as long as I could. I just chilled out and I worked out, wrote, and did other things. That being said, at that time, I had a collection of at least, 300 knives and lots of other weapons. And that's a form of obsessive binge purchasing that gives me a sense of security. So we all have this to some level. Some of us have it to greater extents. We might be stockpilers. Again, without judgment, I think it's important to identify this in ourselves. Next study, behavioral predictors of acute stress symptoms during intense military training. And this is by Smith, King, Voigt, and Litz. I apologize, I don't have their first names. This basically showed a correlation, no surprise, between how we handle our day-to-day stress and how we handled what we might call higher stress or ultimate stress. And there was a direct correlation. People that were terrible at handling stress on a day-to-day basis did not suddenly rise to the occasion. It basically, if you think of your day-to-day coping skill as your baseline, a crisis is an exception state that will tend to detract. And this is something that I've spoken about widely in my writing. We don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our training. So ask yourself, how do you think you handle your day-to-day stress? If you think of the last time you were not happy with how you handled it, what went wrong? What could you have done differently? And for future homework, if there was one, just pick one aspect of your coping skill that you could improve, what would it be? And what could you do today to improve that? For example, if you're not great at talking your way out of things, can you seek out some training on YouTube, watch a clip, read a book? Can you integrate a 5-minute verbal skill activity where you try to talk a certain way with someone you know every single day to build the habit? Identify one coping skill that you think you can improve and one concrete way that you could do it. The next study, guys, we're going to look at post-traumatic stress. This is a huge interest of mine, and there's lots of great studies. I just picked one I have not yet referenced. This one's called Anger and Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Symptom Severity in a Trauma-Exposed Military Population. This is from Novako, Swanson, Gonzalez, and company. Now, simply put, this study showed that when individuals have higher levels of anger during a traumatic experience or a crisis, the higher the level of anger experienced, the more probable it is that they will experience post-traumatic stress. So if we look at anger as a lack or a loss of emotional control, even if we tell ourselves, I'm volunteering for this, I'm choosing anger, I identify with anger, anger has its own current. It's its own form of a wave that just builds and builds and builds, and it can oftentimes, we can lose control of it, and we can lose sight of who we are. Anyone who's really invested in anger knows what that feels like, to literally see red. And sometimes we do things we otherwise would not have. So it comes as no surprise that that could lead to higher levels of intensity in our response, higher levels of guilt or shame, higher levels of legal consequence, and certainly higher PTSD. Now, this is really personal territory. So if you have survived anything traumatic, sometimes it's really normal that we feel insufficient. We sometimes wish we could have been angrier. We would have stood up, acted out for ourselves at that time. Perhaps it might have prevented us from being victimized in the first place. That's certainly the fantasy. When we go back and say, I wish I could have, that's what that fantasy is all about. If not, if we still got chosen and still got victimized, maybe Maybe if we were angrier, had we been angrier, we might have intercepted it. We might have stopped it sooner. Perhaps. But just consider the statistics. The involvement of intense anger tends to increase the likelihood of PTSD afterwards, no matter how justified. So maybe in your visualizations, maybe in our deconstructions, it's more important that we come to peace with an event rather than delaying our healing even further with deeply involved revenge fantasies. Revenge fantasies, dreams, nightmares, it's a natural part of the healing process. Where it gets dangerous is when that becomes our regular operating state and we start to live in a perpetual state of preparedness for that fantasy. Food for thought. I'm going to quote Seneca here again. And he said famously, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." That's very closely related to that Marcus Aurelius quote that I've used before, which is, if we choose not to be harmed, we won't be. Mindset plays a huge, huge, huge effect on this. Next study, tightly related, is the effects of prior deployment and perceived resilience on anger trajectories of combat deployed soldiers. This is by Stein, Ursano, Kessler, and Company. It's from the Journal of Psychological Medicine. So this study found that the two groups of people who had less trajectory in their rage, in their anger during combat, during crises, were those individuals that had previous experience, they had been deployed before, or those who were confident that they were resilient, who perceived themselves as being durable. So just having that confidence, whether it's from experience or from a reframed affirmative mindset, can be enough to change our relationship and our response to anger itself. Of course, this points again to the value of exposure and stress inoculation in your training. So I would ask you for your thought experiment on this one. Can you think of one thing that you would like to experience in order to help you be more exposed to a fear that stresses you? If you're afraid of heights, have you always wanted to do a low altitude indoor rock climb? If you're afraid of dogs, have you always wanted to be around large dogs or maybe go to a handling dog training course? Think of one fear that negatively stresses you and add to your bucket list a concrete thing that you would like to do to safely expose yourself to that stress. All right, the next study is a great one. We're getting into Zen territory. This is entitled "The Men Who Stare at Nothingness," which is a title. I mean, what a band name you got right there, guys. It's by Dr. Amisha Jha, and the article discusses research on mindfulness training for soldiers. Simply put, it indicated that such training can help maintain focus and emotional stability during combat and crises, thereby enhancing operational performance. Some general stats, guys. Approximately 30% of veterans and 16% of active duty military personnel report experiencing problematic anger. And that's usually associated with increased risks of suicidality and violent behavior. Soldiers with a history of impairing anger attacks, being impaired by their anger, before enlisting in the military, are at a higher risk of developing mental health disorders such as anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation after joining the military. So if you join the military because you're angry, it's not necessarily going to cure you and you're more likely to be at risk. If we look at post-deployment adjustments, problematic anger following a combat deployment has been linked to challenges in transitioning to civilian life, including difficulties with mental health, maintaining relationships, and economic stability. I've spoken about it elsewhere at length. There is a very real danger of anger becoming resentment, and resentment alienating us further from society. And particularly for soldiers, but it's also true of police officers, physicians, doctors, surgeons, anybody working to protect others. If you experience a traumatic event, for example, COVID was extremely traumatic for a lot of doctors, a lot of policemen, firemen. If you experience a traumatic event and afterwards find anger that is making you resentful, and that resentment is distancing you further from the society you sought to protect, it's more likely to have negative consequences. So once again, I'm going to quote Rick Fields from his fantastic book, Code of the Warrior. And he said that a warrior must exist like thorns on a rose, there to protect a higher ideal. When the thorns forget that they're there to protect the rose, they just become thorns. They just become nasty bits of business. And similarly, the same study found that anger used as a coping mechanism, that many soldiers perceive anger as being beneficial for performing occupational duties, but the perception is usually associated with worse mental health outcomes, and it can actually hinder the development of healthier coping strategies. So that means that even individuals who say, I do better with anger, actually don't usually do better with anger. Oftentimes it's what we know rather than what we need. There is now in the US Army a training methodology known as hostile bias modification, and or HBMT, hostile bias modification training, that was created to reduce hostile attribution bias and what's termed reactive aggression. It's a computer-based training, and it's actually designed to mitigate unnecessary social conflict. It's designed to improve team dynamics by addressing underlying biases that can lead to aggression. And it's more concerned with the smooth function of the military unit. But it's interesting to notice that the Army themselves are recognizing that purely reactive aggression has a lot of negative consequences. If we look at fields like emotional regulation studies, one great study is entitled When Anger Motivates: Approach States Selectively Influence Running Performance. This is by Giles and Giles, and they looked at using anger as a motivation to help you run faster, believe it or not. And they said anger is a dangerous and destructive pattern, that it is generally not going to help your overall performance. It might give you the perception, the confidence of short-term success. It might even give you a brief adrenal dump, but long-term, it is not a sustainable methodology. Seneca, who I've been quoting throughout, has an entire manifesto on anger. And he argues that anger is not natural and it is not necessary. It's not something we should aspire to. It arises, in his view, from poor reasoning. He actually equated it to a form of temporary madness. And he said, along with other vices like alcohol, for example, it affects our judgment and our sanity. He said that anger generally comes from false expectations. One of the key Stoic insights is this notion that anger is a collision between unrealistic hopes and expectations and reality. And if we expect people to always act or justly or to be a certain way, we're setting ourselves up for resentment and rage rather. So learning to see people with, I won't say without judgment, but with more neutral, open judgment, with a little bit more interest in understanding rather than just making decisions, is a key precept in the Stoic approach. The Stoics also, they're the original pundits of prevention is better than cure, and that it's easier to stop anger before it begins to control you, because once it takes hold, it's very, very difficult. So like Aurelius, like Epictetus, Seneca really said, take time every day to go into yourself, to observe where you're at. What's making me angry? What can I do? Visualize for a minute, handling it better. This emphasis on self-control through reflection is in the Zen practices. It's in all of the Asian martial arts, the need for meditation in order to get clarity, reflect on what you did, prepare for what you're going to do. This is huge. Ultimately, the Stoics always present this notion that the wise person is slow to anger, and that it's not to say that a Stoic would be emotionless, but they are emotionally disciplined. The idea is not to suppress, but it's rather to transform. So we should identify our anger, and we should look to replace it with things like patience, humility, gratitude, and rational judgment. Again, it's not to say we don't judge, but we try to be more rational, less emotional in how we do it. So the last thing I want to do is I want to leave you. I quoted in, I believe in that week 5 podcast, a great book by Barbara Ehrenreich called Blood Rights. And I'm going to recommend this book again. She looks at preparation, function, and post-violence for warrior cultures throughout history. Specifically in preparation, most of you know this, so that you certainly know some of these. If you look at warrior cultures across the world throughout time, there are very often preparation rituals. For example, masagi or water purification was used by the samurai standing in a cold lake or under a cold waterfall. Certainly on my first black belt exam, we meditated under a cold waterfall to a degree that it's very uncomfortable and very, very demanding. That is the most obvious and sort of literal purification you can have. The Greek hoplites similarly would bathe in rivers and then don fresh, unworn clothing. This notion of being clean, getting rid of everything that's preoccupying you so you can go into battle without thought. Meditation plays a role in numerous warrior culture. Trance states, chanting, huge. Prayer, getting blessings, having weapons anointed, enormous. There's often special music, special outfits, costumes, not just armor, but it could be war paint. There, in many cultures, the consumption of hallucinogens. The Huns famously would smoke bricks of hash in hash tents, put their heads under it in order to relax themselves before going into combat. Vikings would have giant feasts as if it was their last meal. Other cultures would fast, the complete opposite, to be empty and absolutely not have any, burdens of digestion or needing to go to the bathroom. Zulus would cleanse themselves with smudge sticks and smoke. Similarly, Native Americans used sweat lodges. There are just so many examples and so many different ways of doing it, but it points to this very ancient understanding that violence requires preparation. So whether or not you regard yourself as a warrior, whether or not you think you're likely going to find yourself in physical violence, if you are a director, a manager, if you work in an office and you just need to know how to deal with people better, if you want to be a better parent, if you're dealing with bullying at school, whatever it is, we all feel the need for better preparation. And it is extremely tempting to invest in the emotionality of aggression. And again, to let that revenge fantasy kind of take over our motivation. As someone who started the martial arts because I was attacked, I can tell you I trained really hard, didn't miss a day, dedicated myself to it. And I've told the story where 25 years later, I was teaching a high school class and a young girl looked at me and very innocently said, "Sir, did you ever find those kids that beat you up?" And it had never occurred to me as a thought that I would have been looking for them. But then it led me down a very deep meditation path. How long did I spend fueled by that initial anger? I work as an instructor at the college for interventionists. So everyone from prison guards to social workers to people that will work in rehab or youth centers. And when I'm teaching them, they're oftentimes going through their internships, their stages, and they're encountering their first real life doses of aggression, resistance, and violence. And sometimes those experiences can really anger me. It make me want to defend them, makes me want to train harder. And you got to check yourself, because if I allow myself to get angry and I get lost in that passion, what will I model and project to them? How much more will that be amplified? And then it becomes like a bad photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. It's like that telephone game, but with rage. It just loses all clarity and detail and ultimately just becomes angry. There is a lot of evidence, much more than I quoted here, showing that anger is a short-lived solution and ultimately not the best fuel. We have a lot of empirical evidence. We have a lot of our own mythology and stories of people that I'm sure we famously know who destroyed themselves because of anger. We might even recognize in ourselves that anger is not serving us as well as we would hope. Or maybe we are mythologizing it. Maybe we're celebrating our anger. Maybe we've built our own personal cult of identity around anger. Well, lesser people can't handle anger, not like I can. Anger is what I do. If we start bragging about lineages of anger, how angry my teacher was, how angry my family is as a general rule, that oftentimes is an insulation, a protective mechanism that prevents us from really honestly looking at the cost. So again, guys, without judgment, because there are many different paths up to the same summit, I submit this to you for your consideration, because I think even if we are fully invested in anger, even if we believe in it as a sometimes necessary skill, it needs to be carefully controlled. Because I think we would all agree that too much anger can destroy our personal lives and can get us into a lot of excessive response, excessive intensity, and just a lot of negative, damaging things. Even if we fully embrace anger, even if we celebrate it, even if we think anger is great for us, I think most of us would agree that there is such a thing as too much anger, too much rage. Otherwise, why are we defending? What are we looking to protect and curb in, if not the rage and excess anger of others who would take harm us or take from us? So I think it's important that however we approach anger and whatever quantity we think is beneficial for us, that we are always auditing ourselves, that we're always checking and testing ourselves to make sure that we haven't lost sight of the shore and we're not adrift at sea. Guys, I want to thank you very much for all of the feedback that led to this and all of the requests. Please keep them coming. We've had some fantastic responses and the audience is growing really, really fast, and I deeply appreciate it. As always, I want to thank our sponsor, Naya Defense, your single source security solution. Whether you're looking for physical security, surveillance, or training, Naya Defense has your back, and they have been an incredible ally in this endeavor. And until next week, stay safe and stay strong.